Imagine a country so vast that it stretches across 11 time zones. A land where frozen tundras meet dense forests, where empires have risen and collapsed, and where leaders have dreamed of ruling not just a nation, but shaping the entire world. Russia has always been more than just a place on a map. It has been a force, a mystery, and above all, a rival. And today, even with the United States considered the most powerful nation on Earth, Russia remains its greatest challenger. How did this happen? How did a landlocked medieval principality transform into a nuclear superpower capable of rivaling the might of the United States? To understand why Russia still stands as a rival to America, we need to journey through centuries of ambition, struggle, and raw power. Our story begins in the forests and rivers of Eastern Europe more than 1,000 years ago. Long before Russia became Russia, the region was known as Kiev and Rus, a loose federation of Slavic tribes founded in the 9th century. Its capital, Kiev, grew wealthy by controlling trade routes between Scandinavia and the Byzantine Empire. Christianity came to Rus in the year 988, shaping the culture and identity of the people for centuries. But Kiev and Rus was fragile. Regional princes quarreled, power fractured, and soon, an unstoppable storm swept across the land. The Mongols, in the 13th century. Genghis Khan's descendants invaded the Russian lands, and for 200 years, what would one day become? Russia lived under the shadow of Mongol domination. Cities were burned, princes humiliated, and tribute extracted. But in the darkness, something unexpected happened. The Mongols, harsh as they were, inadvertently laid the foundations of Russian resilience. They centralized administration, demanded discipline, and forced the Russian principalities to toughen up or perish. Among these struggling towns, one began to rise above the rest: Moscow. Moscow's rulers were clever. They collected taxes for the Mongols while secretly building their own strength. By the late 15th century, under the leadership of Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great, Moscow declared independence from Mongol rule. The Russians had endured 2 centuries of humiliation, but now they were ready to turn the tables. And this was just the beginning. Ivan the Great and his grandson, Ivan the Terrible, transformed Moscow from a regional power into the Tsardom of Russia. Ivan the Terrible expanded the state's borders eastward into Siberia, launching the Russian Empire's centuries-long expansion. This was not expansion for its own sake, it was survival. With no natural borders except endless plains, Russia was always vulnerable to invasion. To protect themselves, the Russians believed they needed to expand. And expand they did. By the 17th century, Russian explorers had reached the Pacific Ocean. Think about that. In just a few generations, a landlocked principality became the largest country on Earth, but size alone does not make a superpower. Russia's rulers knew they needed to modernize if they were to stand equal with Europe's great powers. Enter Peter the Great. In the early 18th century, Peter dragged Russia into KHWHO, into KHWA. Into KHWHA is into someone else's arms. Russia's rulers knew they needed to modernize if they needed to modernize. If they were to stand equal with Europe's great KHA, enter Peter the Great into in the early 18th century, the modern age. He built a navy, reformed the army, and fought Sweden to secure access to the Baltic Sea. He built a new capital, St. Petersburg, which he called Russia's window to Europe. Peter forced his nobles to shave their beards, wear European clothes, and learn modern sciences. He was ruthless, even cruel, but his vision transformed Russia into a European empire. By the 19th century, through the Romanov dynasty, Russia had become one of the most powerful empires in the world. Its armies marched into Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Europe. Russian culture flourished with writers like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, composers like Tchaikovsky, and innovations in science. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were forming. While Western Europe industrialized, Russia lagged behind. The majority of its people were still peasants, living in poverty under a rigid autocracy. When the empire was tested in war, those weaknesses were exposed. The Crimean War of the 1850s showed that Russia could no longer compete with Britain and France's industrial might. Reforms followed, including the emancipation of the serfs, but Russia's modernization was slow and painful. The empire still stretched from Poland to the Pacific, yet it was fragile, a giant with feet of clay. And then came the 20th century, which would change everything. The First World War was a disaster for Russia. Its armies were poorly equipped, its people starving, its government incompetent. In 1917, revolution broke out. The Tsar was overthrown, and after months of chaos, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power. For the first time in history, a state openly declared itself communist. Russia was no longer an empire of Tsars, but the Soviet Union. Radical experiment that would shake the world. Lenin and his followers promised to build a classless society. But first they had to survive. Civil war tore Russia apart and millions died. Yet out of the ashes, the Soviet Union emerged stronger. Industry was nationalized, agriculture collectivized, and the state tightened its grip. Lenin died in 1924, and his successor, Joseph Stalin, took power. Stalin's rule was brutal, marked by purges, gulags, and fear. But it was also transformative. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union rapidly industrialized. Entire cities rose from nothing. Steel mills roared to life, and armies were rebuilt. By the 1930s, the Soviet Union had become a global power. And then came World War II. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, few believed the Soviets could survive. But the Red Army, hardened by Stalin's ruthlessness, fought back with incredible ferocity. The battles of Stalingrad and Kursk were turning points not just in the war, but in world history. The Soviet Union lost over 20 million people, but in the end, its armies marched into Berlin. The war left the USSR devastated, but also triumphant. For the first time, Russia stood as one of two global superpowers. The other, of course, was the United States. What followed was one of the most intense rivalries the world has ever seen: the Cold War. The Cold War was not just a battle of armies, it was a battle of ideas. The United States represented democracy and capitalism. Soviet Union represented communism and authoritarianism. Both nations built massive nuclear arsenals, enough to destroy the world many times over. Both sought allies, influence, and dominance across the globe. From Korea to Vietnam, from Cuba to Afghanistan, Cold War shaped the second half of the 20th century. The Soviet Union had immense strengths. It controlled half of Europe. It had vast natural resources, and it built rockets that put the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into space. Its military was second only to the United States, with thousands of tanks, aircraft, and nuclear weapons. Yet the USSR also had weaknesses. Its economy was inefficient, its people lacked freedoms, and its system relied on fear and control. By the 1980s, these cracks widened. The war in Afghanistan drained resources. The arms race with the United States became unsustainable. And when Mikhail Gorbachev attempted reforms, the system collapsed. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the Cold War ended. For a moment, it seemed America had won. The United States stood as the sole superpower, while Russia was left in chaos. Its economy shrank, its people suffered, and its global influence seemed lost. Many in the West believed Russia would never rise again. But history had taught the world one lesson: never underestimate Russia. In the early 2000s, under Vladimir Putin, Russia began to reassert itself. Oil and gas exports fueled its economy. The military was rebuilt. Old Soviet nuclear weapons were maintained and modernized. And Russia began once again to challenge the West. Cyber operations, influence campaigns, and military interventions reminded the world that Russia was still a force to be reckoned with. So why does Russia still rival the United States today? The answer lies in three key factors: geography, resources, and nuclear weapons. First, geography. Russia's vast size gives it natural defense and influence over Eurasia. It borders Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, making it central to global geopolitics. Second, resources. Russia controls some of the world's largest reserves of oil, gas, and minerals. Energy gives Russia not just wealth but leverage, especially over Europe. And third, nuclear weapons. Despite its smaller economy, Russia maintains the largest nuclear arsenal on Earth. With thousands of warheads capable of reaching any target in the United States, in the world of geopolitics, that makes Russia impossible to ignore. But beyond weapons and resources, there is something deeper: Russia's history. This is a nation that has been invaded by Mongols, Napoleon, and Hitler and survived. A nation that lost millions in war and famine, but still rose to challenge the world's greatest powers. A nation that time and again has turned defeat into revival. That resilience is why Russia remains America's rival. Today, the rivalry continues. From NATO's expansion in Europe, to conflicts in Ukraine, to competition in cyberspace and diplomacy, the struggle between Russia and the United States shapes global politics. The Cold War may be over, but the rivalry lives on, a reminder that history never truly ends, it only evolves. So when we ask why Russia rivals the USA, the answer is not just about tanks, missiles, or even oil. It is about centuries of ambition, geography, survival, and identity. Russia does not just want to exist, it wants to be respected, feared, and recognized as a great power. And in that desire, it has always found itself face to face with the United States. The story of Russia's rise is not finished. The rivalry continues. And the question that remains is this: in the future, will this rivalry end in cooperation or in conflict? Only time will tell.